So in this video, we're beginning to think about the evidence for the resurrection. Now remember, whatever evidence we present then needs to explanation. Now the explanation has got to have, remember, both explanatory scope, in other words, an explanation needs to explain all the evidence, and have explanatory power. In other words, the explanation needs to account for the fact, for example, that the disciples were prepared to die for the claim that Jesus was raised from the grave. So what is the evidence, firstly? Well, the evidence is actually quite ordinary in many ways. There's nothing extraordinary about the evidence. So the evidence is, number one, that Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Number two, that he was placed in a tomb. Number three, that the tomb was found empty. And number four, that the disciples went around proclaiming that Jesus Christ is risen. So they're the four evidences. Like I say, there's nothing extraordinary about any of those. During Jesus' time, lots of people were crucified. If anyone claimed to be a leader and was seen to be against the Roman Empire, that was sedition. And so the penalty for sedition was crucifixion. And there are lots of people named Jesus in Jesus' time. It was about as common as the name John or Sean is today. And so that the idea that a man called Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate is uncontroversial. And anyway, outside of the Bible, people kept their own records and histories. And it's recorded in what's called extra-biblical material that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Yeah, it's a bit like if something big happens, you're going to read about it in the newspapers. And in the equivalent of their newspapers, it's reported Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. The idea that Jesus was placed in a tomb, well, what else did you do with dead people? Some people were just buried in graves. Others, if they had a bit more money, was placed in a tomb. The fact that Jesus was placed in a tomb was a little bit controversial because it wasn't his tomb. We're told that a sympathetic religious leader used his tomb for Jesus to be placed in. That the tomb was then found empty is evident. Now we know that because the fourth piece of evidence is self-evidently true. Now the fourth piece of evidence is this: the disciples went around proclaiming that Jesus was alive. And that is good evidence that the tomb was empty. You see, if Jesus was still dead in the tomb, then all the Roman authorities needed to do, all the Jews needed to do, was pull out the dead corpse from the tomb and say, hey, Jesus isn't alive. They never did that. The disciples did, however, proclaim that Jesus was raised. So they're the four bits of evidence that we need to think about. That Jesus was crucified, that he was placed in a tomb, that the tomb was later found empty, and that the disciples proclaimed that Jesus is alive. The question is, how do we account for those four historical truths?